Hi everyone, welcome to American Literature. This week we'll be talking about some Native American writings, and I wanted to talk to you about the cultural collision that's happening as Europeans enter North America. Of course, the Americas are already peopled by Native Americans, and so the literature of this time period is literature that was produced by the Native Americas in a sense. Even though they did not yet have a written literature, they had established oral stories that were prevalent in their culture. And you have to think about how the Native Americans and the Europeans not only collided, but had impacts on each other, their cultures influencing each other during this time period. So the literature produced around the discovery and formulation of what has become the United States of America represents some of the most compelling narratives, critiques, celebrations, and debates surrounding the ethics and ideals that many consider essential to the making of the United States and its literatures. What you need to consider is we're used to all the types of literature that are available to us now. We live in the United States and we have access to all types of genres. We have fiction, nonfiction, we have subgenres of horror and fantastical tales, westerns, anything that we could want to read. But America at this time did not have a literary tradition set yet. There was not an established form of literature. Literature had its roots in Europe, and what the Europeans brought over when they settled here were the ideas and traditions of European writing. However, they're coming over, and what's established here in America at that point was Native American stories, which were oral stories. So very interesting how these two cultures come together, and this is the root of what we know as early American literature. So these early writings from North America were writings in which the continent and its indigenous people impacted the consciousness of the European visitors. These were products of English exploration. So this drama begins here, and it's really interesting how Ben Franklin describes it. There's a hubbub of voices in different languages. So we have many tribes, Native American tribes, who speak different languages. We have the European language. But Franklin calls it a great mixing of peoples from the whole Atlantic basin. So this influence and exchange between these peoples is ultimately going to produce this new hybrid cultural universe of the Atlantic world, everyone coming together in this diversity of languages and cultures. So next we have some of these stories of the beginning of the world, and the Iroquois and Navajo narratives that we're going to read. They were translations, but we see them as written narratives here in the course, but these were not written down by the Native Americans at the time. This was purely an oral culture. They told these stories around the fire. They were passed down through generations. They were a verbal history of how they came into being and what their belief systems were. So the only way that these stories became written down was that the Europeans eventually wrote them down. And these narratives present a worldview that are very markedly contrasting with the worldview that the colonizers brought, but they're a very solid representation of early Native American culture. And of course, there's some questions that start coming up as we consider the idea that it's the Europeans who are writing down these stories and not the Native Americans themselves. And the first question we can ask is it really American literature if it's not in a written form? And the answer is yes, it is. But here's some questions we can look at. How are these readings considered American literature, or even a significant precursor of American literature? So should we discount them altogether? Much of it was written down by Europeans who never thought of themselves as belonging to any place other than their homeland. Much of the rest wasn't really written in the strict sense, but spoken by members of cultures without written language, and in contexts that no commentary can make fully accessible to most of us. And all of this indigenous material was set down or overheard, translated, and transcribed by outsiders a long time ago. So if you think about that, if you think about the Europeans transcribing these stories as they heard them themselves, you have to wonder if they were transcribed accurately, or were they transcribed perhaps with a European intention to change some of the content of those stories. And those are things that we can't know. We hope that those stories were translated as accurately as possible. So if many of these works were never even published in the modern sense until recently, and were not written for publication, then what sort of reading are we engaged in here? Are we reading as a literary public, as antiquarians, as intruders? These are good questions to ask ourselves as we look at these. But again, I like to think of this as so important because this is that representation of the Native American culture that we can become familiarized with through these stories. So these two writers, Barr Tokin and Ticini Scott, wrote an essay called Poetic Retranslation and the Pretty Languages of the Yellow Man. And they also go on to talk about some of these barriers of translation. And here's what they say. How are we to presume we can reconstitute the original presentation properly? My response is to suggest that we can at least come closer to real presentation that is now provided for us in the awkwardly serviceable and often primitive sounding prose translations of linguists who are not anyhow as involved in the study of live literature as in the recovery of almost moribund languages. So these writers are saying that we can use what we have, the information that we have, to try to come as close as possible to the original presentations that were given. So these really are a beginning of a literary tradition in America, these Native American texts. It says you might think of these non-literary texts as precursors to a literary tradition that will flower in the 18th and 19th centuries. While not necessarily written as literature, they nevertheless employ the creative use of language that appears in poems, novels, and plays. Often, nonfiction accounts of the world are constructed in a manner akin to fictional texts. They create protagonists and antagonists. They have plots filled with action, conflict, transformation, and growth, and they instill in readers a sense of wonder, sympathy, hope, or fear. Similarly, sermons and letters share much of the imaginative expressiveness we tend to associate with lyric poetry, a self-reflexive posture that externalizes the internalized nature of identity, an economy of language, and the use of words and phrases charged with a multiplicity of meanings. So this is very true as you look at these creation stories, the use of language, the imagination that goes into these stories is wonderful, and it really is a beginning for the writing in America. Another thing to consider is that the American experience was multicultural from the beginning, because we do have this collision of cultures that come together to represent what will soon become a tradition of American literature, and that's really important. So I hope you enjoy looking at these Native American stories this week, and we'll talk to you soon.